Hello and welcome to this Chess Heroes video entitled Did Bobby Fischer Really Do That? He probably did. So there's a lot of info out there on Bobby Fischer. He's an excellent chess master to study. You know, if you're a beginner, advanced, whatever level, you can never go wrong by studying Bobby Fischer. So I have a game today where Bobby Fischer has the white pieces. This was played in 1970, and he's playing Jose Luis Garcia Bachelet. All right, so in this game, Bobby Fischer starts out with e4, and he was noted for saying e4, moving this pawn out two in front of the king, is best by test. So he tried different openings and he felt that this move was best because it allows you to get your bishop out, maybe to c4 where you can target the weak f pawn around the king, or you could even move your bishop here attacking a knight if the knight lands on c6, and the queen is able to develop, and it gains space in the center. And also you can castle more quickly. If you get this pawn moved out right away, then you can develop the bishop and the knight, and you're ready to castle the king to safety. So his opponent responds with c5, the Sicilian defense. And Bobby Fischer was also famous for playing with the black pieces, this Sicilian defense. So maybe his opponent wanted to give him some of his own medicine. And the Sicilian defense, it covers this square, d4. That way, it can discourage white from immediately pushing this pawn to the center and having both pawns in the center, because a less valuable flank pawn would trade off a more valuable central pawn. So the game continues with knight to f3. Developing a piece off the back rank, controlling squares in the center, but more importantly, renewing the threat of pushing this pawn to the center. And now, if it is captured, well then, instead of the queen capturing, now the knight can capture and have a nice square in the center. It helps that knight develop up the board further. So, the opponent plays the well, they call this the French variation here because it's kind of like a French defense. But I think there's another name for this opening. I haven't studied it in a while. Is it the Caen variation of the French, or excuse me, of the Sicilian defense? We'll find out here as I make more moves. But this is similar to the French defense where you start out with e4 and then e6, with the idea of pushing this pawn to d5. And that is a common theme in the Sicilian. If this pawn can be pushed to d5, it kind of gives black more room and freedom for his pieces to move. It gives him a little more space. So the game continues with that d4 pawn push. The pawn is captured and the knight recaptures. So if we look at the position here, we have two central pawns for black, and white only has one. But white has more space in the center at the moment, and the knight is further developed up the board. So the game continues with a6 being played. A common move in the Sicilian, keeping pieces out of the b5 square, maybe preventing a bishop from developing there with check once this pawn is moved on d7. So the game continues with knight developing, protects the central pawn, gets a piece off the back rank, and it's usually a good idea to develop your knights before the bishops because they're slower than the bishops. You know, and the knights are almost always well placed in the center, and the bishops, you kind of want to wait and see where it will be best to place them. So Fischer's opponent develops the queen to c7 here. Another common move in the Sicilian, you line up on the c-file, this half-open c-file, in case white castles to the queen side, or if white castles to the king side, the queen is also eyeing the king side as well. So the game continues with bishop developing towards the center. White is ready to castle. The pawn has been fortified, and the pawn is aiming towards the king side, where black will probably castle, as his queen side is a little open. All right, the game continues with knight developing forward here, putting a little bit of pressure on the pawn, but the pawn is adequately defended by knight and bishop at the moment. So now another option would have been to develop this knight, attacking the unprotected knight here on d4, and that knight would probably drop back here to b3. If the knight were to capture knight on c6, well, then black could recapture with a pawn towards the center, kind of reinforcing the center and the idea of pushing this pawn to d5, which is a common theme in the Sicilian. So we have castling by white. His king is safe now. It can only be attacked head on or from the side. Nothing can attack from the right here. So if the king was left in the center, it could be attacked from 3 different directions. So another reason why it's important to castle early and often, it gives your opponent less avenues of attack against your king. So the pawn presses forward here, gaining space on the queen side, a threat of chasing the knight perhaps, and also the bishop can fianchetto here and pile up the pressure on this e4 pawn. So the game continues with rook defending the central pawn. Bishop does develop, lining up on the pawn along with the knight, and a threat of maybe chasing this knight and getting rid of one of the defenders of that pawn on e4. So the game continues with the pawn just pushing forward, getting out of the line of fire, chasing a knight, gaining space in the center. So the knight presses forward, and now we have an opportunity. Will Fischer exchange knights here? Let's find out. The knights are exchanged, and the bishop recaptures here. So we have a centralized bishop, but black does have a backwards pawn here, which could be a weakness in the endgame. So we continue with Bobby Fischer gaining space on the queen side and attacking the pawn, threatening to capture, and that pawn cannot recapture, or else rook will capture rook here. So, well, I guess he can do that. I take that back, because this bishop is keeping an eye on that rook. So what will happen with this pawn confrontation here? The other option is this: capture. If the pawn captures, there's a recapture with the knight, perhaps, attacking the queen. So that's a possibility. And to avoid any trouble on the queen side, Fischer's opponent presses forward, gaining space with b4. And now the the bishop centralizes. Generally, you don't want to move a piece twice until you get all the pieces off the back rank. So this other bishop needs developed. The queen needs developed. The rooks need to find the best squares. So the computer says this is an inaccuracy. And sure enough, it likes a queen move here, queen to g4, lining up on this pawn, and maybe discouraging this bishop from moving because it's protecting that pawn. So the game continues with an exchange of bishops. We have a recapture here, and the rook comes off the back rank. Perhaps it can shuffle over here to the side on the G file if the king decides to castle king side. So knight attacks knight. We have Fischer ignoring that in favor of development, and as the knight was attacking this pawn along with the queen, we have the bishop backing that up. So the game continues with rook grabbing the half-open C file, creating a battery with the queen Another common strategy in the Sicilian defense. Rook and queen trying to take control of the half-open c-file, and only the queen is well, the knight's protecting as well, but if those are exchanged, we could have a pawn perhaps snatched here. So let's see. I don't know. There could be other threats, though. If the queen captures here in the future, this rook could attack and backed up by the bishop. And if the queen tries to move out of the way, the rook could pick off this rook with a check. So a lot going on here. The game continues with Fischer centralizing his rook, trying to help protect this pawn. The computer says that's an inaccuracy, that queen to e2 would be better. Interesting decision by the computer there. But either way, Fischer is ahead. So we have queen to a7. His opponent returns the favor with an inaccuracy of his own. He is applying more pressure to this knight. So, how will the incredible Fischer respond? The knight is under attack along with this knight, but it's protected well. And a common theme in high-level chess is to place a piece where it's lined up on a more valuable piece. So the queen is lined up on the king, even though there's a pawn and a knight in between, but you never know when things will open up. And there's a possibility of developing the bishop and having even more pressure on that knight. All right. Pawn presses forward, helping to back up the knight. And we have capture, an inaccuracy. Apparently it would have been better to just go ahead and pick off the knight. So now we have rook capturing, the best move in the position. And it looks like, can the knight be captured? No, because the rook is unprotected on the back rank here. So bishop adds more pressure, but now we have Fischer finding the best move, and it is a great move here, just protecting the knight, which is under attack by 1, 2, 3 pieces. But the knight, remember, is pinned to the rook here. But once the king castles, that rook will be protected. So what does Fischer do? After his opponent castles, and this is a mistake, apparently bishop to b6 would have been better, because now we have rook captures. And this is a missed opportunity. The computer says that it would have been better to play knight, let's see, knight to b5, is that correct? So the knight could move here, attacking the queen, and then there'll be a discovered attack on the bishop here. So, a lot going on. The game continues with a capture, and then the queen recaptures. But now we have the knight capturing this way. A great move by Fischer. He takes out a pawn. The rook is under attack. The queen is under attack by knight and bishop. So the game continues with the queen sidestepping the trouble and going to a5, a mistake. Apparently, queen to e7 would have been a better move, because also the queen is attacking that, but it cannot capture because there would be a back rank mate here. So the game continues with pawn pushing forward, the best move in the position. What will Fischer's opponent do about this? Well, we have a capture by the knight, and then knight captures rook. So at this point, after, we do not have a recapture. Interesting move by the opponent. Apparently it would have been best to just go ahead and capture this knight. But Fischer would be ahead by the equivalent of a pawn after that. Or would it be even? It would be even after that. So why did his opponent not capture? In the game, we have this move. Threatening to apply pressure. Well, maybe just capture here. So let's see what should have been played. If you just capture the rook, well, things are even, material's even, but Fischer would be ahead, especially after this move. Pinning the knight to the queen, and that pressure would just build up. The rook could try and come over here and protect it, but then the queen could get involved, and that knight would probably fall. So, in the game, we had this move being played. Fischer picks off a pawn, rescues his knight, and now the game continues with rook forking, knight forking rook and queen here. So, how will things continue? Well, let's find out. We have queen lining up on the king. So, that's looking a little bit dangerous. The queen is also protecting. So, instead of the knight picking that rook off, which, let's see if, what would happen if the knight were to capture. Well, then you have this. Check. Knight could go ahead and pick that off. But then you would have this move here with a back rank mate. So Fischer he does a very good job of keeping an eye on the back rank. He even wrote a book, I think it was called Bobby Fischer Teaches Chess, where he talked about all the different ways that you can attack the back rank. And it was a tactics book, a tactics puzzle book, and I recommend that book. Anyway, if we get back to the game, we have the bishop lined up on the queen. We have, apparently the computer recommends capturing that rook with the knight, but instead this was played. So now we have knight delivering check to the king. The king runs into the corner, and in accuracy, it would have been better to run out towards the center. But there is a mate in 8 here that would begin with what? Queen to d7. So then there's a threat of just going here to e8 and delivering a mate. So knight to e2 could be played. King attacks the knight. Rook to c1 check. Bishop would capture. So yeah, it's not looking good for black in that scenario. So let's finish out the final moves in the game and see what Fischer did to finish off his opponent. So here we have king running into the corner. And now, what do you think Fischer did here? This is what I was referring to in the title. Did Fischer really just do that? So he sacrifices his queen. And this is where the game ended. Now, why did the game end? Because it's a mate in 3. So you can try and see if you can figure that out, and unless you already looked at the answer up here. So let's see what happens. With that queen sacrifice, the king would be forced to capture here. Well, then you could follow up with the rook check, because this bishop is cutting off the king's escape. The king cannot come forward. The king would not want to go into the corner, or the rook would just deliver a mate on g8 backed up by the knight. So the best move would be to run towards the center, but even then the king cannot escape because we have rook to g8. The king would be forced to go to e7, and then rook to e8 mate here. A lovely pattern of knight protecting the rook. And whenever you have a rook checking the king from a central side position here. So all the squares around the king, you have 8 squares, 3, 3, so in this scenario, the rook is going to cover all these in the center, here and here. And because the knight is protecting the rook, it can't be captured. The only squares that the rook does not cover are here, here, and here. These 4 squares. So the rook kind of makes a T pattern of the squares that he covers. And these 4 squares are not covered by the rook, so other pieces must do that. The pawn prevents the king from escaping. The pawn here covers these 2 squares, and the knight covers that one. So a great pattern there. All right. Well, in the future, I'm going to do a series of playlist videos by player. So Jeremy Silman, a great chess author and teacher who wrote many good books, he recommended that you try and learn from players that have a style that you enjoy. So, when I was younger, I studied games of Bobby Fischer because he was one of my favorite players. But, you kind of may want to start with an easier player, an older chess master, because their games are easier to understand. And then as you improve with your chess, work your way up. So I don't know if Fischer was the best person to emulate. I tried to play his openings, and I learned a lot, but his openings could be more complicated. So if you picked an older chess master to be your chess hero, that might help you, especially if you're a beginner, to look at older games that are more easy to understand. And especially with today's chess masters using computers, a lot of games can be difficult to understand. All right, so yes, in the future, I will do a series of playlists, and each playlist will have games by one player. So in the future, I'll do a playlist with Bobby Fischer games, and I might have 10 or 20 games in there, and then I'll do that for other famous players, and that way you can go in there and look at these future playlists and choose whatever your favorite chess player is and look at their games. All right, well, please feel free to leave any comments, like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching, and have a super chess day.